We're still looking at AO1, we're looking at structure. We've looked at a lot of structure work in the last few videos to do with the structure of prose and the structure of drama. And today, hold on to your hats, we're looking at the structure of poetry. And there is so much that I'm going to go through today. You really should pick up a copy of the book because it's all written out there and detailed and explained fully. But I will whiz through some of the structure that we can expect to find in poetry. The first thing is stanzas. Now, the poetic equivalent of a paragraph is a verse or a stanza. And you can use either of those words. Some teachers, just depends what your teacher likes to use really. The different stanza lengths and their names are broken into different terminology. The first is couplet. So a couplet is 2 lines of verse. Now if the lines rhyme, they're called a rhyming couplet. Pretty simple. And if the couplet is in iambic pentameter, it's a heroic couplet. After that we have a tercet, a stanza of 3 lines that often rhymes. And if the rhyme scheme is AAA, it's a triplet. Now if you're wondering what we mean by rhyme scheme, you'll find out in this video a little bit later. A quatrain then is a stanza of 4 lines. There are 4 types of rhymed quatrains. The cross rhyme, ABAB, the envelope rhyme, ABBA, the rhyming couplets, AABB, and the monorhyme, AAAA. So again, rhyme schemes are important for your understanding of poetry, and a lot of people struggle with them, but they're really easy to work out, so don't panic. A quatrain, then, is a stanza or poem of 5 lines, and all limericks are quatrains. A sestet is a group of 6 lines in poetry, and you might recognise that word if you've looked at the Petrarchan sonnets, because they're found often in the second half of a Petrarchan sonnet. And often the octave, the first 8 lines of a sonnet, pose a problem that the sestet, the final 6 lines, then go on to solve. A septet, you can think about what this is yourself, I'm sure, is a stanza of 7 lines, and an octave is a stanza of 8 lines. And again, as I just said, often the beginning of a Petrarchan sonnet. So those are the kind of names we give to the number of lines in a verse. I always think it's fascinating with poetry to think about when do the verses change and why. You know, there is so much to be worked out and analysed just from that. So now you know how to name those verses. Whenever you look at poetry, look at when the verses change, see if you can work out why. The next thing that we're going to look at are the structural features relating to language. Now, some of the following features apply to a range of genres, others to poetry only, but they should be pretty self-evident when we go through them. The first one is anaphora, the repetition of the same word or words at the beginning of sentences. For example, you can see in this example the repetition of the word this. You might hear my dog moaning in the background. He wants to go in the garden, so I'll pause the video and put the dog out. Okay, he's out. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land. Of course, that is a lyric from JLS. Oh no, sorry, it's Shakespeare's Richard II. Now, that's an example of anaphora, where you can see the repetition of the word this beginning the sentences. The next one's interesting, a little tidbit that you could use in a quiz here, I think, quite interesting. Apostrophe. Now, we all know apostrophe is a punctuation mark, but it's also a word which is used to describe a sudden address to an inanimate object or somebody who is dead or not there. Isn't that interesting? I've got to admit, Kerry Lewis, genius that you are, I didn't know that myself. Imagine if she just put it in the book for a laugh. Of course she didn't. Here's an example. Oh, Rose, thou art sick. That's in The Sick Rose by William Blake. And here we have apostrophe because what's happening? It's a sudden address to an inanimate object. of a rose. Okay, blank verse is the same as iambic pentameter, but iambic pentameter rhymes and blank verse does not. Now you'll see that quite often in these definitions I'm referring to something that I'm then going to explain. And that's because they're in alphabetical order. But you might think, well, I don't know what iambic pentameter is, but don't worry. Okay, caesura is a significant pause within a line of poetry, usually shown by a full stop, a colon, a semicolon, ellipsis or dash. The use of punctuation in poetry is again something that people often overlook and don't even think about. But the use of punctuation is so significant, so if you see a full stop, colon, semicolon, ellipsis or a dash, think about why it's used. Elision, which you might know from your GCSEs when working on the spoken language study, is where you leave out parts of a word, and an apostrophe shows where the letters have been missed out. And you can see in this little table here, Shakespeare uses tis rather than it is, ne'er, ne'er rather than never, and ha rather than have. So the apostrophe gives us a clue something's been taken out. We call that elision. How are you doing so far? Enjambment, as the French would probably pronounce this beautiful word. In poetry, it's where a line carries over into the next line. So a sentence in a poem that doesn't end at the end of the line, it actually carries on into the next line or even the next stanza. Here's an example from Edmund Spenser. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Now, interestingly, when you're quoting an example of enjambment, you can use a forward slash to show where the line ends on the poem. So you don't have to write it out exactly as you see it here on the screen. You could just put a little forward slash there. And often poets use enjambment. You want to think about the effect of that. Very interesting. End stop is a full stop at the end of a line of poetry. Feminine rhyme, this is a clever one, is a rhyme of stressed syllables followed by one or more unstressed syllable. For example, in Those Eyes by Ben Jonson, we see feminine rhyme with seeing and being. Ah, do not wanton with those eyes, lest I be sick with seeing, nor cast them down, but let them rise, lest shame destroy their being. So you can see there's what is happening is you've got a rhyme of stressed syllables followed by unstressed syllables. Free verse is poetry that has no pattern in line length, metre or rhyme. And if you find it, you need to think about why it's used. What is the effect? Hypermetrical is where a line of verse has an extra syllable. For example, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, there are 11 instead of 10 syllables in that most famous line, to be or not to be, that is the question. Now, the thing about this kind of technique is that you often don't spot it because you're not thinking for a second that Shakespeare might break his iambic pentameter. So you have to be really clever and be looking for syllables all the time. When are they used? Why are they used? Monorhyme, which has got nothing to do with the closely linked monobrow, is a rhyme scheme in which all the lines have the same rhyme. Plosive, you might know about, is the sounds p, b, t and d. And you can think of them exploding out of your mouth. In fact, it's a bit like beatboxing, isn't it? Plosives. You need to think about the sound these make as they come out of your mouth and how they affect the tone of a poem. So often with poetry, it is about that performance. It is about how does it sound when being read aloud, which is why we've got to get into the habit of reading poetry aloud. Polysyndeton, as well as being a girl who was in my primary class with me, is the multiple use of conjunctions. For example, the empty house is quiet and cold and sad and old. The multiple use of the word and there, the conjunction and. A refrain in poetry is a repeated line or a phrase at regular intervals, and in music we would think of it as a chorus. Rhyme, words with an identical or similar vowel sound followed by an identical or similar consonant sound. You know what rhyme is, that's just the technical way of describing it. Cup and pup being an example. With I rhyme, E-Y-E rhyme, the vowels and final consonants look as if they should rhyme, but they don't. So good and food have the same vowels and the same consonants at the end, but they don't sound the same. Internal rhyme is where a word in the middle of a line rhymes with a word at the end of a line or within a different line. And often if you look at hip-hop music, the reason Eminem's raps flow so quickly off the tongue is because it's not just end rhyme, but there are internal rhymes, numerous rhymes throughout the raps that make the speed just quicken. Masculine rhyme is rhyme between stressed syllables at the end of a line of poetry, stop, pop, complain, refrain, as opposed to rhyme between unstressed syllables at the end of a line of poetry, which we've already looked at, which is, of course, feminine rhyme. Now, rhyme scheme, a regular pattern of rhyme within a stanza or poem. Now, to work out a rhyme scheme, this is what you do. You look at the last syllable of the word at the end of line 1. Okay, so let's give you an example of a poem. So in this poem here, the last syllable, or the last word is would, and you put an A next to that. Line 1, A. Now you look at the last syllable of the next line, and if it's the same as the previous one, you also call it A, but if it's not, you call it B. And then you go through, and if anyone is the same as A or B, you call them A or B, but if it's a totally new one, you call it C. And you go all the way through the alphabet, if you need to, until you reach the end of the stanza. So the rhyme scheme of this poem, written by an anonymous woman in the 12th century, would be A, B, A, 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 B, A, B. Okay. Rhythm. The pattern is stressed and unstressed syllables in verse or prose. And there are lots of different types of rhythm that we can look at. Of course, we've already looked at stanza, a formal word for verse. Some teachers like to use it, some don't. Just do what your teacher likes. Syllable, a unit of sound. For example, exercising has 4 syllables. Now, there was a boy in my class once called Elvis, and he said if you put your hand under your chin and you say a word out loud, clearly, your hand will move the amount of times that the amount of syllables that word has. So the word exercising, my hand moved 4 times. I thought that was great. What about supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? Put your comment in the comment section about how many syllables that word has. A word with 1 syllable, like bang, is monosyllabic, while a word with more than 1 syllable is polysyllabic. Who was also in my primary school. Lovely girl. Used to sit next to Polysyndeton. The volta is a turn in argument in a sonnet. It depends whether it's a Petrarchan sonnet or a Shakespeare sonnet where the volta comes. Shakespeare, the dramatist that he was, liked to end with his volta in the rhyming couplet at the end. But we often saw it in the middle of the Petrarchan sonnet. So that's it for this video. More to go through. Would you think structure is ever going to end? Please do subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, buy the A-level guide, follow Mrs. Spag on Twitter, put a comment in the comments section about how many syllables are in supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and after that you deserve a nice rest.